A young girl devastated by a list of chronic illnesses and terminal cancer. A nation's sweetheart and her loving and devoted mother. How did this seemingly perfect family end in tragedy? Today we're going to talk about the murder of DeeDee Blanchard and the horrifying events that led to this. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you're watching this. Boy, do I have a story for you today. This case will make you feel all kinds of ways. There are twists and turns at every corner, and I swear every possible emotion that I could feel ran through my body at some point during this. This is such a big case. There is so much on it. There was so much media attention for this family before the murder as well as after. There was a lot of research, but I wanted to compile everything that I possibly could into this without making it too big. I don't know how big this video will be, but there is a lot on it, so hopefully I can size it down into something and give you all the information as best I can. So before we get into today's case, I wanted to give a little bit of background regarding the people involved. I really like to understand a little bit of the background, why things happened, how things came to be, why this escalated so severely as it did. And as this case was complete and utterly publicised, there was a lot of information around the background of DeeDee. So I'm going to just explain a little bit of DeeDee's background as best I can before we get into more events of DeeDee and Gypsy. Claudine, or DeeDee as she was known by her friends, Blanchard, was born on May the 3rd, 1967 in Chack Bay, Louisiana. DeeDee was one of 6 children from parents Claude Anthony Pitar Sr. and Emma Lois Gisclair. The children were Claude Jr., Claudia, Dorla, Tate, Evans, and Claudine, who got her nickname of DeeDee, and as that is what she's known in this story, that's what I'll be calling her from this point on. Before we can delve onto the character and background of DeeDee, I think it's important to talk about Emma, DeeDee's mother, just because there is a lot mentioned about her, and I find it quite interesting to see the correlation between Emma and DeeDee. Claude Pitar Sr. said that Emma was a known shoplifter, and he'd actually lost track of how many times that Emma went to court for theft. DeeDee's stepmother Laura, in the 2017 documentary Mummy, Dead and Dearest, also mentioned that Emma was known to also steal people's clothes from the local laundromat. It is also claimed that Emma had once stolen between $3,000 and $4,000 off of Claude's father. In this documentary as well, there is something horrible that is mentioned. Although it's alleged by the family members, there is no concrete evidence of what I'm about to say, but it is said that Emma Pitar did feel severely ill, and DeeDee was her carer. Whilst DeeDee would look after Emma, it is said that she would withhold food and starve her in her frail state. The claims of starvation is backed by more members of DeeDee's family, and those that believe it do also believe that DeeDee killed her mother by starvation. Emma Pitar died in 1997 at the age of 59. Laura truly believes that DeeDee killed Emma because she also has a horrifying story of her own. In the documentary, Laura says that DeeDee was caring for Laura, and while she was caring for Laura, DeeDee put small parts of weed killer into Laura's food. This claim is backed by DeeDee's nephew. When DeeDee lived with Laura and Claude, Laura was bedridden for 9 months and she was getting sicker and sicker and sicker. But one day there was a family gathering and an argument ensued about the treatment that DeeDee was giving to Laura. This then caused DeeDee to be forced to leave that house. But upon DeeDee leaving, Laura made a full recovery. She got better and literally made a full recovery after DeeDee had left. DeeDee is said to be a lot like her mother Emma, all the way down to stealing and using manipulation to get what she wanted. DeeDee's family also made claims that DeeDee would steal from members of the family, and she would do this as a form of retaliation when she didn't get things that she wanted or things didn't go her way. It is also mentioned that DeeDee dabbled in witchcraft, and a lot of people called her a really weird girl. I don't think witchcraft is weird, but maybe that's just me. But I don't think that DeeDee was doing it in a positive way. I think she was potentially saying to people, I'll curse you, or I know a spell that I can put on you. I don't know. I've never seen anything to suggest that DeeDee actually went up to people and said that she could curse them or make a voodoo doll of them, but that's the impression that I get. I get that she was using her witchcraft knowledge as a way of scaring people into doing what she wanted. Fast forward now, and DeeDee is 24. And at some point, I couldn't find out exactly when, but at some point in DeeDee's working career, she was working as a nurse's aide. Now, this is a really key part of this story because as a nurse's aide, DeeDee had the information and understanding of medical terminologies and illnesses. And we will come back to this a little bit later on in the story. So again, DeeDee is now 24 and she enjoys socializing, she enjoys going out, and one night she decides to go to a bowling alley. At the bowling alley, she meets a boy called Rod Blanchard. I stress the term boy because he was 17. He was 17 and still in high school. The two got along well and had a few more dates, and things soon escalated when DeeDee became pregnant. Now this set incredibly badly with me because DeeDee is a 24-year-old woman. Rod is 17. He's in high school. He's a teenager. I had to look up the legal age of consent in Louisiana, and I did find that it is 17 in the state of Louisiana, but it just sits so badly with me. Like, she is 24, he is 17. I just can't get my head around it because say there were 2 years before that, he'd be 15, she'd be 22. I just don't personally understand what attraction a 24-year-old could see in a 17-year-old. And also it just feels so wrong to me. Anyway, we'll move on. We're not going to hold on to that. DeeDee got pregnant. Due to the pregnancy, Rob decided that the best and most honourable thing to do was marry DeeDee. But unfortunately this wasn't to last, as just before the birth of their baby, Rod realised that he wasn't in love with DeeDee. He said he didn't marry her for the right reasons, and because of this, he wanted a divorce. Now, of course, you can expect that DeeDee absolutely did not want this. DeeDee had begged Rod to reconsider, but much to DeeDee's upset, the pair did separate. Once their little girl was born, they decided to name her Gypsy Rose. Gypsy because DeeDee loved the name, and Rose because of Rod's love for the band Guns N' Roses. Now, during my research, there was something that kept coming up, and it was a TV series called The Act. And in The Act, it depicts the life of DeeDee, Gypsy and Rod. And it also shows that Rod wasn't actually as involved as Rod says he was. In The Act, it does depict Rod's involvement with Gypsy a lot differently. But these are the words from Rod, and he said that although he was only 18 when Gypsy was born, he wanted to be as involved as he could. He was incredibly scared to become a father, but he wanted to be there as much as he could and do the best he could for Gypsy. He is quoted with saying that Gypsy was a beautiful baby and there was nothing wrong with her. After the birth of Gypsy, DeeDee tries again to get back with Rod. However, he definitely doesn't want to get back with DeeDee, and so the two decide to co-parent. When Gypsy is 3 months old, Rod has a phone call from DeeDee. DeeDee says that Gypsy has got sleep apnea and she needs to go to the hospital. So DeeDee decides to take Gypsy to the hospital. DeeDee would take Gypsy to the hospital and demand a sleep monitor and overnight stays. However, the doctors could not find anything wrong with Gypsy, even though DeeDee was insistent that there was something wrong with her. From here on, matters get a lot worse, and DeeDee is now convinced that Gypsy has asthma and muscular dystrophy. Due to having muscular dystrophy, Gypsy is now confined to the use of a wheelchair as she could not walk. DeeDee also reported that Gypsy had the mental capacity of a 7-year-old due to being premature at birth. So again, DeeDee is seeing loads of doctors, loads of specialists, and actually Gypsy has now a huge diagnosis for all these illnesses that Gypsy has. I have a picture and I will add that into this video so you can see. Feel free to pause this video because there is a lot on this list. By the time that Gypsy was in the 2nd grade, DeeDee thought it was in her best interest to be homeschooled due to her various chronic illnesses. And it was around this time that DeeDee and Gypsy were living with Claude and Laura. You know that bit earlier I said about the weed killer incident? That was when Gypsy and DeeDee were living with Claude and Laura. And the reason as to why DeeDee was forced to leave wasn't just the treatment of Laura, it was the treatment that DeeDee was giving to Gypsy. This is when DeeDee and Gypsy would move to Slidell, Louisiana. DeeDee and Gypsy would spend a lot of time going to hospitals and seeing specialists. They would also go to the Children's Hospital in New Orleans. It was at this point that Gypsy was diagnosed with hearing and visual impairments, and she was now on a cocktail of medication. In each of these appointments, it's reported that Gypsy never said a word to a doctor or a specialist. DeeDee would do all the speaking for Gypsy. To make matters worse, in 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit. Hurricane Katrina is documented as one of the worst natural disasters in modern history. A Category 5 hurricane that claimed the lives of over 1,800 people and caused $125 billion of damages. Amongst the devastation was the loss of Gypsy and DeeDee's home. In this, they also lost Gypsy's birth certificate and medical records. DeeDee and Gypsy were forced to move from Slidell to Aurora, Missouri. In Aurora, DeeDee and Gypsy had to completely restart their lives again. DeeDee was also the main and only caregiver to Gypsy, and she said that she had to be permanently by Gypsy's side. She also had full custody over Gypsy and limited the visitation that Rod would get. Rod would try and make arrangements to see Gypsy, but weirdly enough, every time that Rod and Gypsy had arranged to see each other, there would suddenly be a medical appointment or a hospital visit that DeeDee would say that Gypsy had to go to. There was always something in the way as to why Rod couldn't see Gypsy. For 3 years, DeeDee and Gypsy lived in public housing, and their rental payments were paid because of Gypsy's chronic illnesses. Rod, in the documentary, also mentions that he was giving welfare payments for childcare for around £1,200 a month. In 2008, Habitat for Humanity built them their own custom home. It was pink and it had a wheelchair slope all the way from the ground up to the house, customised for Gypsy. When Habitat for Humanity got involved with Gypsy and DeeDee and built them a home, this sparked a media frenzy, and loads of other charities wanted to get involved and help the family. They started to be gifted flights to medical appointments, trips to Disney World, they had gifts given to them, they were also meeting with celebrities. They had backstage passes to Miranda Lambert concerts, and Miranda Lambert actually gifted Gypsy some money. Everyone loved DeeDee and Gypsy. DeeDee was seen as this super welcoming lady, so bubbly, so full of energy, and everyone who met her felt like her family. And of course, DeeDee also made out that she was the perfect mother. She was always there for Gypsy, would never leave her side, and of course, who doesn't love a mother who loves her child? Gypsy was this really sweet, innocent little girl with a permanent smile on her face. Gypsy also had this very unique voice. It was very high-pitched and childlike.
Right now, I'm in Cinderella's castle eating some royal mashed potatoes. I love it.
So from 2008 and more charities getting involved and more people wanting to see Gypsy and see if they could help, this is when matters got worse for DeeDee. Gypsy had an appointment with a specialist for MS. The doctor ran tests, but he could not find anything wrong with Gypsy. He asked DeeDee about the previous medical records and previous tests that were done, but DeeDee did reply that everything was lost in Katrina. The doctor was still quite curious about the diagnosis, so he decided to get in contact with the previous doctors that had seen Gypsy. When he spoke to these other doctors, it was also revealed that they also couldn't find anything wrong with Gypsy. This then made the specialist quite confident that Gypsy wasn't suffering with most, if any, of her conditions. He also wrote in his report that he believes this is a case of Munchausen's by proxy syndrome. So I went on Google to get a definition of Munchausen's by proxy, and I'll read it now. Munchausen by proxy syndrome, a psychological disorder in which a caregiver, and especially a parent, induces the symptoms of a disease or injury in their child, falsifies the child's medical history, or tampers with the child's diagnostic specimens in order to create a situation that typically requires medical attention. Factitious disorder. But unfortunately, this report kind of got swept under the rug because there were so many people seeing Gypsy, and people were just really believing that something was wrong with Gypsy. She looked ill, she was in a wheelchair, and why would someone lie over what was wrong with Gypsy? The specialist report kind of fell on deaf ears. In 2010, Gypsy would start using her home computer late at night when her mother DeeDee was asleep. Gypsy's former computer had been smashed after an incident that had happened with an unnamed man that Gypsy had met at a sci-fi convention. Gypsy had planned to go to his hotel, and she did have sexual relations with this 35-year-old man. Gypsy at the time was only 15 years old. I say that in quotations, we'll come back to that later. So of course, DeeDee found out, she burst into the hotel room and she gave the medical records of Gypsy to this man and was like, she is 15. I don't know what else was said, but I can't imagine it was very nice. But upon this, DeeDee forced Gypsy to leave the hotel room. After this, Gypsy was threatened with violence and her computer was destroyed. Gypsy didn't really have any friends in the real world. I don't think DeeDee really ever let her find people of her own age or find people that she could go and hang out with. She was always at DeeDee's hip, so she found the internet as a really amazing escape of the real life that she was living. So of course, from the incident and also that DeeDee would constantly monitor what Gypsy did online, Gypsy would have to go online in secret. DeeDee would constantly tell Gypsy what to say, what to do, so Gypsy wanted to have this real life where she could be who she wanted to be on the internet. Gypsy wanted to chat to boys, she wanted to be a normal teenager, she wanted to speak to friends about things that were going on in her life. And one night in 2012, Gypsy meets a man called Nick Godejohn on a Christian online dating website. Nick Godejohn reveals that when he first started talking to Gypsy, he was absolutely infatuated by her. He said that he was immediately drawn to her and that it was love at first sight. Gypsy and Nick started dating, and they would have many conversations about their future together. They would also have conversations about the real world, sex, and even their baby names. To avoid DeeDee finding out about Gypsy and Nick's relationship, it is reported that Gypsy had 5 different Facebook accounts so she could talk to Nick. In 2015, Gypsy really wanted to introduce Nick to DeeDee. She wanted to get the approval from DeeDee so that Nick and Gypsy could start a life together. To not raise any suspicion about them previously talking online, Gypsy and Nick came up with the plan that they would meet at a movie theatre for the showing of Cinderella, you know, the live action one, to not raise any suspicion that they had previously been talking online. They were going to play it that it was their first time meeting, and hopefully DeeDee would just fall in love with Nick as Gypsy did, but not quite the way Gypsy did. So in the movie theatre, Gypsy would strike up a conversation with Nick and they would really get along, and Gypsy would invite Nick to sit with her and DeeDee in the showing. But when DeeDee first met Nick, she did not like him at all. I mean, of course she didn't. She didn't like anyone talking to Gypsy. However, this did not stop the couple from continuing their relationship online. There was also something I found about this particular evening, that Gypsy and Nick at one point did decide to sneak off and they would have sex with each other in the bathroom. But I can't fathom, how did they both get away from DeeDee? Why would DeeDee allow Gypsy to leave her? DeeDee was constantly obsessed with Gypsy and all of her actions, and I can't imagine that there was a point that Gypsy could just be like, oh, I'm going to the bathroom now, and then Nick goes, oh, I'm going to the bathroom now, and DeeDee doesn't raise suspicion. I mean, she obviously didn't, because that is what they've both said happened, but it does seem weird and I can't work out at what point this would have happened. Also in 2010, Gypsy finds her Medicaid card, which is like a form of ID for her hospital appointments. On this ID, it said that Gypsy was 18 years old. DeeDee had told Gypsy that at this point in time, she was only 14. Her dad had called her on her 18th birthday to wish her a happy birthday, but DeeDee had said to him beforehand, do not tell Gypsy that she is 18. She believes she is 14 years old. I don't know why Rod decided to go along with this. I think it's because DeeDee had told people that Gypsy's mind was a lot younger than it was. So I think Rod just went along with whatever DeeDee said to make it the best situation for Gypsy. We now know, though, that this was another example and another way that DeeDee could just consistently keep ownership over Gypsy. If Gypsy believed that she was younger than she was, DeeDee still had all the power over her. DeeDee also gave Gypsy a lot of drugs. Some were prescribed, but some weren't. This goes back to when DeeDee was working as a nurse's aide. She knows about medications and she knows the side effects of what those medications will do. She would also put Gypsy on a tranquilizer type drug, which would make Gypsy incredibly drowsy. She also had Gypsy on medications that would make Gypsy drool, and that was just to reinforce the idea that Gypsy was physically and mentally disabled. DeeDee would also keep Gypsy's medication in a floor-to-ceiling cupboard. And in this cupboard, the medication was really weirdly labelled. It had things like shaky baby for anti-seizure drugs. Literally, the label would say shaky baby. Fortunately or unfortunately, Gypsy did know that she didn't need these drugs. Gypsy knew that she could walk. However, if Gypsy did ever walk, instead of using her wheelchair, her mother would hit her with a coat hanger.
When she wasn't around, did you get up and walk secretly?
I did, yes, sir.
Did she ever catch you walking?
She did a couple times.
And what did she say or do?
She got so upset with me, she would punish me so bad. Like, she started hitting me with a coat hanger and telling me all kinds of mean things. She would tell me that she wished she had an abortion when she had the chance.
This is not the only incident of physical abuse that we know. There was once a time that DeeDee threatened Gypsy with the words, "If you ever do that again, I will smash your fingers with a hammer." So Gypsy was alone and she was living in hell and she had no one to talk to, but she did have Nick. Gypsy would tell Nick everything, the truth, everything. They had been talking for 3 years before the events of today's case took place. In 2015, a plan was hatched between Gypsy and Nick. The couple realised that they had 2 options. One option was to get Gypsy pregnant and the other option was to kill DeeDee. The pregnancy was an idea that DeeDee would fall in love with the child and therefore have to accept Nick into the family. However, Nick did not want to impregnate, so they thought the best option was to kill her instead. It was schemed that Nick would travel down to Springfield, where Gypsy and DeeDee were currently living. Gypsy would let Nick in, and Nick would stab DeeDee. Gypsy stole money from DeeDee to pay for Nick's flight. Gypsy also bought gloves to give to Nick when he turned up. And on the 10th of June 2015, this plan was executed. When Nick arrived at Gypsy's home, it was late at night. Gypsy let Nick in and then she went and hid in the bathroom. Nick went straight to DeeDee's room where she was laying face down on the bed and Nick stabbed her. Gypsy does recall that DeeDee screamed for Gypsy, but Gypsy was too scared to leave the bathroom and help her. Once DeeDee was dead, it is then reported that Nick and Gypsy went to Gypsy's bedroom and had sex. Between the 10th and the 14th of June, Gypsy and Nick had made their way back to Nick's house in Wisconsin. And on the 14th of June, a disturbing and horrifying post was posted to DeeDee's and Gypsy's joint Facebook account. The post read, "That bitch is dead." Friends and family of DeeDee and Gypsy were incredibly worried, and very soon a police car was dispatched to Gypsy's home. When the officers arrived, they got into the house and they found that DeeDee was dead and Gypsy was missing. Now, when the police couldn't find Gypsy, it was a new worry because they thought that Gypsy had been kidnapped. The public believed that something seriously wrong had happened to Gypsy, but the police had a suspicion that Gypsy had a part to play in the death of DeeDee. Police tracked the IP address of the Facebook post to Wisconsin at Nick's home, and the pair were quickly arrested. Nick surrendered immediately, and very soon after, Gypsy also surrendered by walking out of the house and walking towards the police. This was incredibly shocking because everyone knew this family and everyone knew that Gypsy could not walk. The media soon found out, and then of course friends and family and the general public found out too. They had found out the truth about Gypsy and it was a humongous shock. I mean, these people had been giving donations to Gypsy and DeeDee. These people were friends of DeeDee and Gypsy, and everyone just saw them as this sweet, vulnerable family. But they did find out that this whole charade was a scam, and DeeDee had forced Gypsy to play a huge role in this scam. In questioning, Nick told the police everything. Gypsy, however, decided to play it differently. She wanted to play dumb, and when the police were questioning her, Gypsy would say things like, "Where's my mum? What's happened to my mum?"
Your mom's dead, okay? Now, what I want to ask you is, your mom's passed away, okay? And she's deceased, all right? Yeah. Okay.
But the police saw through her lies immediately. Eventually, Gypsy did confess, and she also said that DeeDee had been abusing her whole life. It took the courts about a month to find all of Gypsy's medical records. Within this, they found as well a power of attorney document that stated that DeeDee also had power over Gypsy beyond the age of 18. When the judge was finally able to access the records, he issued a plea deal to Gypsy because of the complexity of the situation. Gypsy pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received the minimum sentence of 10 years. This was in July 2016, and she will be eligible for parole in 2023. Yeah, next year. When she is eligible for parole, she'll be 32 years old. Nick received life in prison for first-degree murder without parole. Even though Gypsy was sentenced quite quickly, Nick Godejohn had to wait for his sentencing until February 22nd, 2019. Since the murder, Gypsy has had multiple interviews, one including with ABC and one including with Dr. Phil.
But you know now you didn't have epilepsy.
I know now.
You know now you didn't need to be in that wheelchair.
Mm-hmm.
You know now she was making all of that up.
A documentary has been made, and a TV series on Hulu has also been made called The Act. Gypsy said in one of her interviews, "I feel like I'm more free in prison than living with my mum, because now I'm allowed to live like a normal woman." Gypsy is still receiving immense media attention, and her dad Rod has organised an online petition to get Gypsy's sentence reduced. He said that once Gypsy is released from prison, she will have a home with him and Kirsty. They have both said that they hope to put Gypsy on the right path. Gypsy was also in the news this year, only 2 months ago, on the announcement of her getting married. This was to husband Ryan Anderson. Before her marriage, Gypsy was also engaged to another guy called Ken. They had met through a prison pen pal program, but the two called off their engagement in 2019. So that is the case of Gypsy Rose and DeeDee Blanchard. I think it's really sad. I think there is a lot to this case. There was also an extra bit that I didn't know where to put, but I wanted to put it in. I found it incredibly sad, hear me out, but when the ashes of DeeDee came up for collection, no one in her immediate and quite massive family wanted to collect them. I just found that really sad. I know that DeeDee for her whole life has been awful, but the fact that no one wanted to claim her ashes just made me quite sad. I also have this thought, and it doesn't come from any bit of research that I looked at. It doesn't come from anyone but myself. I could be completely wrong here, but I have this horrible feeling that I don't think the mistreatment would stop. I have a horrible feeling that if DeeDee wasn't murdered, DeeDee may have murdered Gypsy. I know it's a wild one, but DeeDee had the history of abusing her mother. DeeDee had the history of abusing Laura, and DeeDee obviously had the history of abusing Gypsy, and I just wonder how far that would have gone. There was also the power of attorney that DeeDee had for Gypsy, so that even once Gypsy reached adulthood, she could still control her. And I just don't know if things would have taken an even worse turn somewhere down the line. I don't know that if this all, like the media attention, the gifts, the meeting with celebrities, if all of that kind of dried up, would DeeDee have found other measures to keep her name in the spotlight? DeeDee loved receiving care and attention from the media, and I just have this sickening feeling that if Gypsy did step out of line, DeeDee would have found other ways to make sure that Gypsy never stepped out of line again. It's horrible. It's horrible. It's a horrible theory, but there's just too much in the history of DeeDee for me to think otherwise. I, of course, am not then saying that what Gypsy and Nick did was justified. It was evil. It was sickening. There was other ways that Gypsy could have resolved this. She could have stood up. She could have stood up in an interview. She could have just walked, and then the facade would have died, and that's it, case closed. Like, she could have left DeeDee, gone to the police and said that she's been mentally and physically abused, and that would have resolved it. They didn't have to kill DeeDee. So I'm absolutely not on the side of the murderer. Absolutely not. Because there are definitely other ways that this could have been handled. My thoughts are with everyone that has been negatively involved in this case. I do feel for DeeDee in a way, because, you know, she didn't need to get murdered. I immensely feel for Gypsy because she didn't need to be abused. I feel for the family and friends that were ultimately living in this lie with Gypsy and DeeDee. I feel for everyone that's been negatively hurt by the actions of DeeDee and Gypsy. But for now, that is all from me. If you made it to the end, thank you so much. I hope this was informative. I felt this had to be my very first true crime story just because it was so wild from start to finish. It was just so interesting. There was a lot of media coverage on it. There still is today. And thank you for listening to me talk about it. Hope to see you in the next one. That's all from me. Bye for now.